someone like me could get in that bad situation, it could happen to anyone. And that was kind of the spur that made me think, actually, I need to put this stuff down in writing.
The stories we tell ourselves play a huge role in shaping our perception of reality and our perception of ourselves as well and our behavior. And my guest today, Brin Hodgskiss, is an author who has written the book that you can probably see here in the background called Serial Killers. You'd think a book about serial killers would be focused on the grim and dark aspects of it, but his book that he co-wrote with Nicole Engelbrecht takes a different approach and gives a human side of things, not painting people as mere sociopaths or psychopaths that have this maladaptive trait or personality types. Brin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Kenan. And really looking forward to chatting about killer stories.
Yeah, I think it's a book anybody should read. And the opening of the book, the little passage that you have there, I found interesting. This book is dedicated to preserving an idea, the idea that listening to one another's stories can make life better. Why do you have that belief?
That belief, I mean, the superficial answer, Keenan, is like, I studied narrative psychology. That's what I did my doctorate in. So, of course, I'm going to believe that. But the real reason, if it had to come down to a single event, was about 10 years after I finished doing my doctorate. It was sunny morning, sunny afternoon. I walked into the kitchen at my family's home and I thought, I'm going to kill myself. And I knew where I was going to do it. I knew how I was going to do it. And it was just such a relief that all these thoughts that had been boiling away in my head and had kind of got on top of me would just end. And in that moment, luckily I got quite angry at myself. I was like, because I worked for the police for a long time. I know what death looks like, and I thought my family's going to walk in on that, and what am I doing? And luckily I spoke to someone, but that then started the journey for me about understanding what led me up to that point. And one of the things I identified was what led me to that point was I was telling myself bad stories about myself. And I thought, you know what, if someone like me, who's, come from a pretty privileged background, I've got loving parents, I've got, friends who enjoy having me around, hopefully most of the time.
Yeah, and it's amazing that, there can be objective reality, but each of us have our own subjective experience. And, that experience is shaped by prior experiences, but then it's also, we also don't understand what's going on in the back of our mind. What was your experience like? What was the story you were telling yourself that drove you to that point?
You know what? And I didn't really explore that too much in the book, but probably for me, the story that I told myself a lot, and I don't know quite where it came from. I don't know. Maybe it came from some genetic experience. Maybe it was an early life event. Because as I say in the book, these things interact. But it was a story that was telling myself that I just wasn't good enough. That everything I was doing was a bit lousy, and I just didn't compare particularly well with anyone else around me, and there's just no point with trying. And of course, if you're telling yourself that story, that's what you pay attention to in the world around you. So because I was telling myself a story that I was a bit of a loser, I was picking all the examples of where I haven't succeeded in my life. I was thinking about, the career promotions I didn't get. I was thinking about, the relationships I messed up. And it was just all the opportunities I never took. And that was what got on top of me. So for me, the challenge was to say, okay, that's one story that I've chosen to tell myself. I need to pay attention to some others.
Okay, yeah, and the interesting thing I found with stories is each and every story has an impact on you. So there's a
Mm.
book that I've been reading, what is it? The The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. And one of the
Yes,
things is,
it's a great book.
yeah, so you've seen the book like says there's a reason that works of fiction resonate with us so much because we place ourselves in the shoes of the protagonist more often than not. That we see certain qualities in them and we project it onto ourselves, and we not only explore what it is like to be that person, but we also compare ourselves to that ideal.
You know, I don't remember if it was in Will Storr's book or in another bit of research I read about storytelling, but they've done research actually tracking the brain activity of people listening to stories and people telling stories, and they found something they call neural coupling. So that means that the neural the what my brain is up to in telling the story starts to be reflected in your brain activity. So, so I'm actually, so while I'm describing a story, let's say they used a story of your first day at high school, while I'm talking about how nervous or exciting it was, you are experiencing nervous and excitement. If I'm talking about doing an activity, your brain, that part of your brain that governs that activity is activated. So, it is genuine, like mind linking when you get engaged in a really good story.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's not just you mirroring somebody's actions. You know, when you want to build rapport, you're going to do the same hand movements and everything. It's
Yeah,
literally your being experience similar phenomenon.
perfect way of putting it.
Okay, and you know, that's also the fascinating thing with stories is you may relate with it in one aspect, and you know, whoever tells the story might have a certain intention, but what is the story that we listen to the most? It's the one that goes on in our head, and the story that we repeat is going to be the one that you end up acting out.
Absolutely. And you know what? That was where, going back a step to sort of the origin story of the book Killer Stories was I was I must have been about 23, 24 years old. And I was at university, and the academic department I was working with was doing some research with the South African police. Particularly, we're doing research with Mickey Pistorius, who was the first head of the investigative psychology unit and a pioneer in offender profiling. And Mickey said, I need somebody to be like Robert Resler in the USA and go from prison to prison and interview serial murderers so we can understand more about their behaviors. We can build up our research. And so that person was me. So I went from maximum security prison to maximum security prison speaking to serial murderers. And in the end, spoke to about a dozen and tape recorded them. And one of the things that really stood out for me as I was driving between prisons in my second-hand student car was the role that stories played in their offending. So the stories those serial murderers were telling themselves about themselves then started to get played out in their crimes, and they helped their crimes continue.
Okay, what did the story seem like?
Well, you know what? I don't want to reveal everything in the book because I know you very kindly have bought it, but I'd love your readers to buy it too. But so there were a number of different features in the book. I call them the killer stories. So there was a number of different stories, features that the guys told, and I know we can discuss a couple now. The first thing to say though is that their stories weren't insane. There's always this image we get from Hollywood that serial murderers are like this different breed of people. But actually, most of these interviews were me sitting across from a table almost like we would be sitting across from each other if we're sitting in a coffee shop or something, speaking with another human. And their stories had their own logic. So it wasn't completely crazy. And I had to often remind myself after I'd been speaking with the guy for a few hours, was like, actually, he's talking about killing people, not talking about going to have a cup of tea. That's how normal some of this stuff sounded.
Yeah, and I think, looking at it like that also guards yourself against this idea that they are completely different to you. Like, if you probably, yeah, there's an idea that if you had the exact same experiences as another person, there is a high likelihood we would possibly go down the same road. And one book that I've been reading I find fascinating and deals with it directly is The Brothers Karamazov. And the main character, Alyosha, he's the son of this man who's an alcoholic, and, he always has this in his mind. That could be me if I'm not careful, if I don't guard against it. For him, it was his father was like that, so there's also this genetic component that might be at play. But it's when we do not even perceive that there's this potential with us in for this potential for chaos, you get blindsided, and you can kind of deceive yourself until you go too far down this path.
Yeah, that is fundamentally what I believe. I'm realistic because I spent after I did this research, I spent about 15 years in the police, and I'm realistic that if we tell ourselves a really bad story about themselves, you probably wouldn't, you, Keenan, probably wouldn't become a serial murderer and kill 50 people. But what I am convinced of is that these stories can have a really powerful effect on it. I've lived that myself, but I'm sure your listeners, if you start to tell yourself a negative story, it's not going to end up well for you. You might not kill loads of people, but you'll have a pretty miserable life.
It's one thing to look at things as well, things aren't bad, but it's not at that point. If we look at the stories we tell ourselves, it can be that we use certain actions to justify our own actions. When something seems bad, we use that as, well, it's my life might be bad, but it's not as that bad as that, or my actions aren't that bad, I could do worse. We look for ways to justify things, sort of an ego defense.
Totally, because our beliefs want to protect themselves. There's another piece of fascinating research that I think was from the University of Southern California, which found that when we are presented with an idea that challenges some of our deeply held beliefs, we respond to it with the same parts of our brain that respond to a physical attack. So it's like an idea that's threatening to your ideas, we worry about as much as a punch in the face. So, or our brain, it's the same part of our brain that responds. So we do want to defend our own egos. And interestingly, it's like even some of the terms. So the term serial killer, most of the guys I spoke to, they were adamant they weren't serial killers. They were like, no, 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 I'm not a serial killer because serial killers are crazy and I see them all in Hollywood all the time. It's like I'm just a normal human who's killed some people, but I'm different from them because you still want to have that perception that you aren't as evil as the epitome of evil you see in like Hannibal Lecter. I mean, but a good example actually, and drawing one from the book, a good example of the role stories can play in changing how you perceive the world around you is the story of the man we call Sasanda. So I've anonymized all the cases in the book because I was collecting the stories as part of psychological research. I have an ethical obligation to protect the participants. So I'd promised to change names. So the man we call Sasanda, he had a certain story he told himself from like the earliest part of his life. And that story went something like, I hate being rejected. And I've always been rejected from when I'm a kid. I don't have friends, they don't want to play with me. And the only way I can feel better if I get rejected is by having physical violence, by lashing out. So he describes growing up and getting in fights with people all the time. Um, and then he gets interested in girls, and he really likes girls. And he then gets involved in multiple different relationships. But one of the things, again, that triggered when he gets rejected, he says to himself, I have to be violent. He said, and he described it once as, or he's described it quite a few times in the time we were talking, is this is who I am. In order to, in order to be a man, I must dominate. And being violent is showing them who I am. And that narrative grew and grew to eventually take over his life. He was running a successful business, he was married, he was training to become a pastor, but eventually that narrative of I have to be violent, I have to seek vengeance for any rejection took over, and it led to him committing a number of murders and rapes because that was the only story he started to see in his life. All the other stories about who he was kind of faded into the background because of that central one.
Oh, that is a very daunting story because if I think it doesn't sound like he had anything particularly irrational, and there's a quote attributed to Niels Bohr when he was speaking with Einstein, and it was sort of like not completely a criticism, but it was like he was telling Einstein there's certain stuff he's not considering, and the quote is, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical." And that's the thing with logic. It only makes sense if you have a certain, pathway that you see between the different ideas, how they interrelate with one another. And with Sasanda's story, it sounds like he had a justification for each action. It wasn't merely just impulsive. Like he had a story constructed that, you know, justified what he is doing. It wasn't, I just feel like killing somebody. No, it's X, and then you have your black box, and then output, kill the person.
Yeah, and you know what? It wasn't even particularly a black box. It was perfect. All of the stories your listeners will pick up in the book, they all have that sense of logic. Your story, one of the role, stories make our lives meaningful. Instead of random chaos, we create little chains of cause and effect. Actually, another piece of great research is, and this research is now almost 90 years old and it's been redone thousands of times. It's Heidel and Semmel's research where they show people a random shapes moving on a screen, and about 97% of people don't say, "Oh, that's just random shapes moving on a screen." 97% of people make up a story. They say, "Oh, that's a big dog chasing a little dog," and they run into the house, and then the cat jumps through the window. Or that's a man chasing a woman, and then another man comes and protects her. So we make up stories whether we like to or not.
Oh, so even with shapes, we attribute certain features and ideas onto them. Like it doesn't have to be anything we actually see.
Absolutely, and we do the same with our own lives. We turn them into stories to make it meaningful. And I guess that for me was the biggest difference between my research and some of the other research I've seen in this field. So, I mean, and I only really realized this example because I finished doing the research and then I went to a conference in Liverpool, and people were presenting loads of papers. There was quite a few papers on serial murder, and I presumed everyone had spoken with a serial murderer. And I only realized halfway through, I was like, most of the people were writing about books. They were writing about books that had been written about Ted Bundy or Ed Kemper from the 80s. No, very few people had sat down and spoken to serial murderers. Um, and the reason I mention it was because when I was speaking to serial murderers, I had feelings of self doubt As I said, that's something I wrestle with. And I was sitting there thinking, why am I not hearing in what the serial murderers are telling me? Why am I not getting all the stuff that the literature says should be there? In American interviews, they always said it was always about sexual fantasy. Deep, deep-rooted sexual fantasy builds up over time and eventually explodes. And I wasn't really getting that from these guys. And of course, fantasies can be unconscious, they can be unexpressed, but that didn't seem quite right. That I just wasn't getting fantasy. And what I realized it was much more was that actually what the most important thing was right there on the surface. And it's something I didn't really realize when I was 24, but when I came back to this like 20 years later, I realized actually the meaning is right there, right in front of your eyes. You've just got to listen to the story because the story explains stuff every bit as well as deep and dark sexual fantasy. So rather than dig beneath the surface hoping to find this nugget, it's just about knitting together what's right in front of your eyes.
Yeah, theory and reality are only the same in theory.
Yeah.
And I similarly with psychology, like you've seen the evolution of the field of psychology, where initially it was like the psychologist is the expert and he will tell you what's wrong with you, he'll diagnose you and everything, to this more humanistic approach where it's um, empathizing with people, trying to understand where they come from, being more emotive with Carl Rogers, and then now where there's also this idea of decolonizing psychology. So not just taking a universal approach, but also looking at it in contextual based circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you've probably got a better handle on the history of psychology than I do, actually. That was a brilliant summary. But yeah, it is that. And I'm very much positioned more in the humanistic side. I mean, and there is an element of like in terms of um, allowing the person's own experience to come through rather than me as the psychologist colonizing it with what I think should be there. Um, and it's one of the things I haven't done for the book, but I'd love to do in future. It's like speak with guys again, because my story's changed in the 20 years since I spoke to these guys. Their stories would probably have changed too.
Yeah, that would be fascinating. It's the Japanese proverb, no man steps in the same river twice, because neither is he the same man nor is it the same river. Like there's change in both. And something I found,
Yeah.
yeah, oh,
No,
something
no,
I found
carry on, carry on.
fascinating with your book was, I would think it would be tough to speak with somebody who's a serial killer, but they seemed super keen and eager to talk with you. And this is an extract from the book. It became clear that the stories I was being told were important. The men I spoke with wanted to tell their stories. It was important to them that they were heard. So it's not just listening to stories, it's also we desire to tell the stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also it's giving people the space to tell their story. Um, because I think, these are just my hypotheses, but the reason I think they liked chatting to me was I wasn't particularly threatening. I was a skinny 24-year-old student. Um, I just wanted to listen to what they were saying. I wasn't part of the prison system. I was just curious, and I was willing to sit for as long as it took for them to tell me what they wanted to hear. So maybe I was a bit of amusement, maybe I was a bit of enjoyment, but people did like having the space to tell their stories. If I had to criticize my interview technique, if I'm honest, because I kept all the tapes, having to go back and listen to interviews I did 20 years before, probably one thing I would do differently now would be giving the guys even more space to talk. Because I had an interview structure that I went through, and I knew a lot about them before I stepped through the door, because every interview was like a mini investigation, just preparing for it. But I probably would have given them more space, and let them shape their own narrative a bit more.
Okay, so you did the interviews about 20 years ago. How has your perception or interpretation of the stories changed over that time?
That's a great question. The thing that hadn't changed was I thought stories were powerful. The thing that probably had changed was realizing even more profoundly that those some of those killer stories could also be operating in myself. Um, but then equally coming back again to that sort of pile of tapes that had sat in a dusty box for for the best part of 20 years. There were some stories I didn't notice 20 years ago that I noticed now. So the one, I noticed this one, one of the stories that I call the fog, that complete absence of a narrative. Um, but the other story I noticed much more was the whole victim narrative. There was a sense that, and this was sort of almost a story that applied to all the other killer stories. There was the sense that the men described saw themselves as being helpless victims in a cruel world. It's like, it's not my fault I killed these people. It's because I had a bad life. I had a bad upbringing. What do you expect? What would you do in my position? And that victim narrative came out really strongly.
Yeah, and it's quite a scary thing. It's very easy to feel as a victim. And typically in stories, the victim is the person we resonate with the most. We want to see the victim overcome adversity. We want to see them be the hero in the end. And I guess the stories also point to the potential downside of it, that if the injustice is not really there, then it's kind of maladaptive.
Totally. And yeah, I take it even a scarier step forward further is that even if the injustice is there, we can take it a bit far. So we can, because a lot of the guys did have really unfortunate and cruel events in their upbringing. Um, but that victim narrative starts to why they were justify to them why it's okay for them to take revenge, even if the revenge is out of all proportion of for the original crime. I mean, rejecting a man, that man cannot justify killing you based on that rejection. But that victim narrative is so accepted in our own culture that we think, oh yeah, well, it's taking revenge. Yeah, we've got loads of revenge movies. This is just the same. Just the same as in Taken or in Braveheart. It's me standing up against the oppressor.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope from the single person that wronged you and you taking revenge to it being the whole world. And I think a good place where we can see, not just in the context of a serial killer, it's if you look at the online space where there's this movement where men will be rejected by women and it's suddenly all women are bad or all people are like this. Like we have this generalization that happens with anything. And you see it in politics, in the US now, in particular with the elections. It's all people on the right are like this, all people on the left are like this, because you have one bad experience with an individual.
You know what? I'm so glad you brought those examples up because those are the examples that I really worry about. Like online, how you get this polarization of opinion and the assumption that the people with different beliefs from you are out to get you. It's bizarre. It's like you see it in the discussions around the trans community. It's like, I know people who are trans, and it's like what comes out often in the online narrative is like they are dangerous and out to get you. And I'm like, no, most people just want to be want to live their life. Similarly, politics, and that's where I think the victim narrative is almost the most dangerous because it is such a powerful story in our society that a lot of politicians, in all parts of the world, I can pick a number of examples, they use that victim narrative to mobilize their followers. And I, I believe we really need to be suspicious of that. Um, Yeah, and actually, I'll even build on it because I was fascinated in the victim narrative, and I'm passionate about it for the reasons you highlighted, because it gets used so often to, I think, to manipulate us. That there was a bit of research I dug out that was really recent. It's not included in the book. It was from uh, 2022. Well, there's two papers, one from 2020, one from 2022, that started to actually find that people who use the victim narrative, they often have a sort of stable personality feature about the tendency to view themselves as victims. And those people are more likely to have psychopathic traits. Because I listened to your previous episode that you did with Cameron Harmon, and you mentioned the dark triad. And they found that people who use that virtuous victim narrative are more likely to have those dark triad characteristics.
Okay, and what do you think is the correlation between the two?
I, you know what, it's always, it might be hard to separate out correlation and causation, but the correlation could simply be that, or at least according to the research, the correlation was using that victim narrative means you can get something out of somebody else without having to pay back, or take. Um, you can get them to either you can get them to accept your unacceptable behaviors, or accept that your violence is actually entirely justified, or accept your manipulation, or oh, sorry, it's like it's not my fault I did this, it's because I'm a victim. So it's a way to rig social relationships in your advantage.
Okay, so it's not only justifying your actions to yourself, it's that you must be able to also justify to others.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Yes. I do think so. And it means you can. It's a way for helping you do what you want. So again, dear listeners, be careful if people are using it, and be careful if you're using it, because it can lead you down a pretty dark path.
Okay, yeah, another quote from the book that I found interesting is their narratives revealed a darker aspect. They had helped to create the offending. How do you think they helped create the offending? So, how did their own actions contribute to the narrative they were constructing in their mind? Because from what I'm getting, a lot of the narrative they drive is external, like the world has done X, Y, Z. How did they themselves contribute to it?
I suppose um, I'm just thinking out loud. I think partly how they how justified themselves. So, for example, in Sasanda's actions, when he was being violent towards a woman, his narrative was actually that's justified, that's okay. And then when he eventually built up to murder, so one of his, I think it was certainly the murder he describes as being most satisfying, was like, actually, this woman, she had rejected me a few times and she was mocking me. So I needed to show her who was boss. And the only way I could show her was by being violent. And then his actions of being violent it becomes like an echo chamber where you're justifying your own actions and pushing yourself on further and further. And a good number of the stories, guys, describe this process of if I had known um, if I had known where this would lead, I would have stopped earlier. I didn't know the story would get out of control as it did.
Okay, it sounds very similar to the story with substance abuse, where it's like, I'm taking this once and it's fine. But eventually, the narrative starts to shape you as well. It starts altering your identity and you adopt it because first it's, I'm just killing somebody to the point where it starts to become, I am a killer. I'm getting that sense.
Yeah, well, and actually, there's the other story, a story of Jacques, and his is a great example of that because he actually describes it in those terms. He describes it as it's like being addicted to a drug. It gets more and more. And interestingly, because I'd asked him, what do you regret? And I was expecting him to say, I regret killing those women. And actually, what he said was, I regret stealing money from my mom's purse when I was 10. And I was like, that's a bit weird. But then he went on to explain this. He said, because that was the start for me. Like, because I enjoyed stealing some money, I went and stole a bit of more money. And then because I enjoyed that, I would walk into other people's houses and steal stuff they had lying around. And because I enjoyed that, I'd actually break into houses. And because I enjoyed breaking into houses, I thought, well, you know what? Next time I break in, if there's a woman there, I'm going to try rape her. And because I tried raping a woman, then I'm like, oh gosh, now they've seen my face. Now I have to kill them. So always there's gradual building, and the story he's telling himself about himself kind of adapts and keeps pace and encourages him to rush onwards.
So it speaks to the importance of not doing stuff that goes against your values, because what happens is not you still keeping your values. You actually start changing your perception of yourself and your values. They start eroding, and every bit of action that you take thereafter erodes it even more and more and more. Where it might be first, this is unacceptable, but it's like you go down a slope. Like it starts off pretty shallow and it's like little, little, little. And then suddenly there's like an exponential shift and you go off the deep end.
Absolutely. And you can see that happening in groups of people too. So really interesting. Something else that was brought up in your previous interview with Cameron Harmon was the Stanford prison experiments. And round about the same time, also the Milgram pain experiments, if you know about those, where and it's almost a classic in the psychological literature, because it's this idea that people, if constraints are removed, will become sadistic. Now, what's really interesting, and if you ever read this book, it's a book called Humankind, and the author does a wonderful job actually debunking some of those experiments, showing that, you know what, actually, the reason they've become so popular was because the researchers kind of almost rigged the research to be dramatic, because it had appealed to our sense of, oh my God, we're evil actually, beneath the thin veneer of civilization, we're evil. The truth is much more subtle, that what a lot of those experiments actually prove, that we will only do bad if we think we have no choice. But even then, like in the Milgram pain experiments, the people would, if they were told they had no choice but to give that lethal shock, every person they experimented would say, no, I'm not going to do that. I do have a choice. The people who did administer the shock were the people who thought they were doing it for good. So what the Milgram pain experiment, so the Milgram pain experiment, what they showed, or what the research always led us to believe, was that if people had the constraints removed, they wouldn't hesitate they would become sadistic. So if somebody said to them, you know, you must give this patient a very severe electric shock, they would do it, because the restraints had been removed, they'd been given permission, and that appealed to something, I think, in the media, that we're actually beneath this thin surface of civilization, we're actually bad people. Now, what the research really demonstrated was that actually, if people were told you have no choice but to give this lethal shock, people wouldn't do it. They would refuse. Almost 100% people said, no, I'm not going to do that. If they were where the people who did give shocks that could have been lethal, it was because they thought they were doing it for the right reasons and they were doing it for good. So they had one of them saying, well, I did this for science. And that's the fascinating thing, because it's the fact that most people aren't bad or evil. Yes, we can tell ourselves stories that can make ourselves bad. But if, for example, you take the category of psychopath, it's about 1% of the population has is psychopathic. Again, if you take this statistics from war, in war situations in the Second World War, in combat, only about a third of soldiers fired their guns. Because most soldiers, most humans don't want to hurt other people and will go out of their way to avoid hurting other people. So it's not the fact, and this is where I disagree with something Cameron Harmon said. Cameron Harmon said people just don't care. Maybe 1% of people just don't care. The truth is more subtle, is I don't care about the people that my stories allow me not to care about. So the people that my story have said are less important, oh, it's okay for me not to care. And that's part of the reason why I phrased the dedication for the book as I did, is like, the more you share stories with people, the harder it is not to care about them. Because suddenly they go from being somebody who looks different or sounds different or eats some different food to being another person, because you've experienced their stories.
Yeah, that is actually interesting. The idea that it's not just doing it to other people, it's that you differentiate yourself from the party that you are harming because they are different from you. And that's sort of the same phenomenon I see happening if you look at war. Hitler is a fascinating example of this. He hated the Jewish people with a passion, but is it wrong to say he hated all people? No, he loved his family. He loved the people close to him. So he's a perfect example of this disconnect between himself and the others.
Absolutely. And then, and I know we don't have endless time because honestly, I could talk about this stuff for hours. But one of the things that is worth drawing out is like, okay, a lot of the stories in the book all sort of follow this classic condemnation arc, like you'd get in a Shakespearean tragedy. Somebody started well, Sasunda had his business, he had his family, then he told himself a bad story and it all crashed downhill and it ended in darkness. Um, and I worried Nicole and I both worried when we were writing the book, is it all going to end up, is everything dark? Is that what we're saying about stories? And actually, McAdams, who I mentioned quite a lot in the book, did a lot of research into redemption narratives and how people can turn it around. And that actually those redemption scripts can become a very powerful way of re-narrating your own lives. So instead of saying, it all went bad and now I'm justified in doing crime, it's much more powerful to go away and think, okay, think of that low point you got to, but then emphasize how the fact you turned it around and tell that story, that redemption narrative to yourself. And in the book, we go in like a really powerful example with Stefan Kutsia and his story about how he, with the help of others, and he's always very adamant, he's like, I did not do this alone. I did this because I had many hands helping me. How he redeemed himself from being somebody who committed some horrible acts, spent 18 years in prison, that now he is a successful author, he's a family man. And that's something I think would be a real. I mean, I'd want every one of the readers to come away from the book with that idea of actually, I can redeem myself. I can turn my story around.
Yeah. A good success story is always nice to hear, but what's even better than a success story is the story of an underdog or a redemption story, where in spite of all the odds against you, you overcome it. Ladies and gentlemen, Brin Hodgskiss. Yeah, if people want to follow your work or get the book, where can they go?
If they want to get the book, you can go to Takealot is probably a good place. But equally, if you're in the US or the UK, you can go to Amazon. They sell it, or you can go to any good bookstore. I know Exclusive Books have it stocked, so go there. If you want to follow me, you can follow me on Facebook as Dr. Brin Hodgskiss, or similarly on Instagram or LinkedIn with exactly the same name.
Awesome. Yeah, I would definitely recommend the book for anybody listening in. So I bought the book on a whim to prepare for the episode with Cameron Almond that Brin referenced here quite a bit. And yeah, the book gave me a lot of insights. If you watched that episode, you would have heard the idea of the victim narrative. That's where I got the inspiration from, where I got the ideas from. And the book is a really good book in the sense that it doesn't paint all the killers as merely being killers. It gives the humane element. You see how, you yourself could have been just like them. And the stories we can tell ourselves and the impact it has on us. It is a great case study in it. It doesn't just tell you the crimes, it tells you why the crimes were committed in the first place. So, Brin, thank you so much for being a guest today. Take care.
And thank you so much for having me. Have a great one.
Nice, sweet.